That's Soul Farm doing Shlomo Carlebach's Nigun Yachad, 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 but I think in a kind of Zydeco New Orleans style. How fun was that? How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we continue to do beautiful, beautiful expositions by our sages of the verses of the book of Esther. It's going to be another fascinating day. And let's see who is with us as we get it going on a quite rainy and cold Wednesday evening here in LA. Pauline in Arkansas, Yehud in South Carolina, Renee in Indiana, Melissa in Great Neck, Paula in Chicago, Stephen in New Hampshire, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Jose in Miami Lakes, Vaughn in Fremont, Ohio, Bella in Florida, Belle in Texas, Lucy in Minnesota, Nancy in North Carolina, Rick in Chicago, Dawn from LA, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, saying, I just contributed to the AT app fund. We're almost at the end of the campaign. The year ends, the annual campaign ends. We'll still receive donations after because I know a lot of people are on holiday, but we won't be promoting it anymore after the new year. So this is the moment to do it, to get the donation match, to help us build the app. Nina put the link in the credits. It's in the comments, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. And thank you, Sharon, and everybody who's already donated, which is like most of the people in the class. We really, really appreciate it. Helena with us from Finland. Always great to see you here. Helena, Brandon in Knoxville. And Paula says, thank God for the rain. Amen. You're absolutely right about that, Paula. Naomi in Maryland. James in Indianapolis. Over there on the YouTube side. Patrice checking in from Utah. All right. Today's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Margaret Sapir for the healing of Stephen S. We don't read people's, healing details, their whole name. We'll just say for Stephen. And may Stephen have a complete and speedy recovery. And Margaret, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings. We say amen. And thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world. I'm reading fast, getting through all the names quickly at the top. So we can get right into it. Yesterday, we couldn't even complete the page. This is the kinds of material where it's just a shame to skip anything. So let's see if we can do the whole daf. We're picking this up at the bottom of the B side of page 15. We are in chapter 1 of Tractate Megillah, the 11th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of Purim. We're in an extended midrashic type of, I wouldn't even call it a digression, but it's a midrashic exposition by our sages of the verses of the book of Esther, and sometimes they even digress from that. At the end of yesterday's page, the discussion was about first how sort of like the different sages commenting on Achashverosh's scepter, the king's scepter, when the queen, Esther, took it upon herself to petition him for his attention, and that was a great risk to her. That's the normal understanding. Yesterday we saw that a deeper understanding is that when she went to the king of her own volition, at that moment she became prohibited to her husband, Mordecai. Up until then, she had become the queen, but basically the king, anytime he had her, was raping her because it was against her will, but she was submitting to the king. Now that she goes to see the king in order to petition that he should save the lives of all the Jews who stand to be annihilated due to Haman's decree, she's going of her own volition. At that moment, she becomes really Achashverosh's wife and no longer is Mordecai's wife. But on the idea of the scepter, that he extended the scepter to her, the sages actually say, just like Pharaoh's daughter, Basia, reaching out for the ark that had Moses in it, baby Moses, and like her arm grew long. It was sort of like something mystical, supernatural was happening. Likewise, the scepter of the king grew long and extended, according to some views, a few cubits, according to another view, many, many, many cubits, hundreds of cubits. Likewise, then the sages interpret about the sons of Haman. In the Megillah, we read that 10 of his sons were executed along with him, but he had other sons apparently. And how many of them? The sages give different expositions. Some say 10, some say 30, some say hundreds. So we pick it up on exposition of, or examination, analysis, interpretation of Esther 6:1. On that night, the sleep of the king was disturbed. Now, this is the episode where the king couldn't sleep one night, and he said, "Bring me the annals of the kingdom." And there he read that his life, the king's life, had been saved by Mordecai the Jew, who, because of his skill in languages acquired when he was a member of the Sanhedrin, he overheard an assassination plot, gave that information to Esther. Esther gave it to the king. The killers were executed. The king's life was saved, but Mordecai was never rewarded for that. On this particular night, he seeks to, he can't sleep, recalls that this happened, has it read before him. What was done for that man? Nothing. Oh, well, we need to reward him. And so that's going to be the huge turn in the story, that Haman was, not only planning to have all the Jews in the world annihilated, but the one that angered him to begin with, Mordecai, he was going to hang him on a gallows 50 cubits high. And of course, Haman himself will end up on that gallows. And the final sequence leading to that begins here. On that night, the sleep of the king was disturbed. And Rabbi Tanchum said, the verse alludes to another king who could not sleep. In other words, the sleep of the king of the universe. Is God a human who needs sleep? Obviously not. In fact, we know that the ruler of the universe neither slumbers nor sleeps. But metaphorically, is what's going on here, is that God is disturbed. God is concerned because the Jews all stand to be annihilated. So the sleep of the King of the universe was disturbed. The Holy One, blessed be He, was disturbed. And the sages say the sleep of the higher ones, the angels, was disturbed. And the sleep of the lower ones, the Jewish people, was disturbed. And Rava said this should be understood literally. The sleep of King Ahasuerus was disturbed. It's not more complicated than that. But according to the other interpretations, and why not, right? There's this death decree that all the Jews in the world are going to be killed on one day. Sure, people were disturbed who care about the fate of the Jews, like God and the Jews themselves and the angels. And this was the reason Ahasuerus could not sleep. A thought occurred to him, and he said to himself, what is this before us that Esther has invited Haman? Right? Yesterday, we talked about all the different reasons why Esther invited Haman to this banquet, that she was planning to set him up, to expose his evil before the king. But there were a lot of other different reasons that were given. So it was odd, right? If she's having a private feast, okay, so it should be her and the king. If she wants it to be a feast with people there, okay, so then there should be like a sort of level of people, the highest ministers or the ministers and the assistant ministers. Some kind of a pyramid of people would be invited. But why this odd threesome? The king, the queen, and Haman, right? Why those three? So that was the question that led to the interpretations yesterday of what was in her mind. But now it's the king sitting up at night, not sleeping, thinking, why did she invite me and Haman? And so thinks the king to himself, perhaps they are conspiring against that man. This is the way that, euphemistically things are said in the Talmud, meaning perhaps they're conspiring to kill me, the king. And he then said again to himself, well, if this is so, is there no man who loves me and would inform me of this conspiracy? Right? You can almost think of like Scarface when Pacino finally gets to the top of that criminal empire. And then from then on, he's just paranoid, descends into terrible paranoia. And it's like these people who claw their way to the top. And as soon as they get there, they're desperately clinging to power and wondering who's trying to take them down. Who can they trust? Who they can't? Right? So, right, that kind of insight into that mentality. So, if so, thinks the king, is there no man who loves me and would inform me of this conspiracy? And he then said again to himself, well, perhaps there is some man who has done a favor for me, and I have not properly rewarded him. And due to that reason, people refrain from revealing to me information regarding such plots, as they see no benefit for themselves. If somebody once informed me of such a plot and he wasn't rewarded, why is anybody else going to step up? Immediately afterward, the verse states, and he commanded the book of remembrances of the Chronicles to be brought. And the verse states, and they read before the king. And the Gemara explains that this passive form, that they were read before, instead of they read the annals or they read the chronicles before the king, rather the chronicles were read before the king. And the Gemara explains that this passive form, and they were read, teaches that they were read miraculously by themselves. And it further says, and it was found written, katuv, at Esther 6:2. And the Gemara asks, why does the Megillah use the word katuv, which indicates that it was newly written? It should have said a writing, kitav, was found, which would indicate that it had been written in the past, right? This happened in the past. Why does it sound like, and there was something in the process of being written that was read before the king? And the Gemara explains, and now we're at the top of 16a, this teaches that Shimshai, the king's scribe who hated the Jews, see Ezra 4:17, was erasing the description of Mordecai's saving the king, and the angel Gabriel was writing it again. Therefore, it was indeed being written in the present. And Rabbi Asi said, Rabbi Shelah, a man of the village of Timarta, taught, if something written down below in this world that is for the benefit of the Jewish people cannot be erased, is it not all the more so the case that something written up above in heaven cannot be erased? Right? So things that have been decreed to the good for the Jewish people in heaven, okay, well, they're going to happen. We don't know when they're going to happen, but if it was said that it's going to happen, it's going to happen. And the verse states that Ahasuerus was told, with regard to Mordecai, nothing has been done for him. And Rava said, it is not because they love Mordecai that the king's servants said this, but rather because they hate Haman. And the verse states, now Haman had come into the outer court of the king's house to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And a sage taught in a Baraisa, this should be understood to mean on the gallows that he had prepared for himself, which indeed is how it came out. And the verse relates that Ahasuerus ordered Haman to fulfill his idea of the proper way to honor one who the king desires, right? The king says to Haman, how should we honor somebody whom the king wants to honor? And Haman, thinking as about himself, says, oh, well, I mean, you want to dress him in the king's finest clothing and parade him around the city on the king's finest horse with somebody announcing before him, such is done for a man that the king wishes to honor. And then the king says, okay, perfect. I love it. That's what I want you to do for Mordecai. Haman cannot believe his ears. That which he prepared for himself is done for another. That which he prepared for another will end up for himself. Okay, right. So the verse relates that Ahasuerus ordered Haman to fulfill his idea of the proper way to honor one who the king desires to glorify by parading him around on the king's horse while wearing the royal garments, and do so to Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that you have spoken, right? The king says to Haman, do exactly what you said should be done to honor such a man. And the Gemara explains that when Ahasuerus said to Haman, and do so to Mordecai, Haman said to him, in an attempt to evade the order, who is Mordecai? And Ahasuerus said to him, the Jew. And Haman then said to him, well, there are several men named Mordecai among the Jews. Ahasuerus then said to him, I refer to the one who sits at the king's gate. Haman said to him, "Well, why award him such a great honor? It would certainly be enough for him to receive one village as an estate, or one river for the levy of taxes." And Ahasuerus said to him, good idea. This too you must give him. Let nothing fail of all that you have spoken, i.e., provide him with all that you proposed and spoke about in addition to what I have said. The Gemara describes what occurred as Haman went to follow the king's orders. As the verse states, then Haman took the apparel and the horse. When he went, he found Mordecai as the sages were sitting before him, and he was demonstrating to them the laws of the handful, kemitza, right? So it's like this. Recall, that's the meal offering, right? When you take very fine ground flour that's offered as an offering in the holy temple on the altar when the temple is standing. And so they were talking about the laws of the meal offering and how it was gathered, and the kemitza is measured like this, with what the 3 fingers here can take from the fine flour that's discussed elsewhere. That's what they happen to be discussing, Mordecai and the other sages, when Haman came to find him so he could, parade him around the city on the king's horse. Once Mordecai saw Haman coming toward him with his horse's reins held in his hands, he became frightened, and he said to the sages, "This evil man has come to kill me. Go away from him so that you should not get burnt from his coals." In other words, that you should not suffer harm as well. At that moment, Mordecai wrapped himself in his prayer shawl and stood up to pray. And Haman came over to where they were and sat down before them and waited until Mordecai finished his prayer. In the interim, as he waited, Haman said to the other sages, "What were you talking about? With what were you occupied?" They said to him, "When the temple is standing, one who pledges a meal offering would bring a handful of fine flour and achieve atonement with it." He said to them, "Your handful of fine flour has come and cast aside my 10,000 pieces of silver, which I had pledged toward the destruction of the Jewish people." When Mordecai finished praying, he said to Haman, "Wicked man, when a slave buys property, to whom belongs the slave and to whom belongs the property? As I once bought you as a slave, what silver can be yours?" And so there's a midrash that at earlier time, this is why Haman hated Mordecai so much. He had been a slave to Mordecai, right? Slavery back then, very different connotation than the way we understand slavery now. It was sort of like where you could end up if you were in debt, more like an indentured servitude. He came out of it. How did he come out of it? Probably paid the debt eventually. I don't know. It's not really elaborated on. But according to this idea, in an earlier time, decades earlier, Mordecai had owned Haman as a slave. And Haman said to him, "Stand up, put on these garments, and ride on this horse, for the king wants you to do so." And Mordecai said to him, "Well, I cannot do so until I enter the bathhouse and trim my hair. For it is not proper conduct to use the king's garments in this state that I am in now." Just like Joseph, when he was summoned to Pharaoh's presence, he said, "I got to get clean. I got to trim myself. I got to get dressed." You got to prepare for that kind of a dignified appearance. So in the meantime, Esther sent messengers and closed all the bathhouses and all the shops of the craftsmen, including the bloodletters and the barbers. And when Haman saw that there was nobody else to do the work, he himself took Mordecai into the bathhouse and washed him. And then he went and brought scissors from his house and trimmed his hair. And while he was trimming his hair, he injured himself and he sighed. And Mordecai said to him, "Why do you sigh?" And Haman said to him, "The man whom the king had once regarded above all his other ministers is now made a bathhouse attendant and a barber." And Mordecai said to him, "Wicked man, were you not once the barber of the village of Khartoum? If so, why do you sigh? You have merely returned to the occupation of your youth." And it was taught in a Baraisa, Haman was the barber of the village of Khartoum for 22 years. After Haman trimmed his hair, Haman dressed Mordecai in the royal garments. Haman then said to him, Mount the horse and ride. Mordecai said to him, I am unable, as my strength has waned from all the days of fasting, because we thought we were all going to be killed, and we still stand to be killed. The decree has not been repealed. So I'm weak from fasting. So Haman stooped down before him, and Mordecai stepped on Haman's back to get on top of the horse. And as he was ascending the horse, Mordecai gave Haman a kick. And Haman said to him, is it not written for you, do not rejoice when your enemy falls? Proverbs 24:17. And Mordecai said to him, this statement applies to the Jews, but with regard to you, it is written, and you shall tread upon their high places. And the verse states, and he proclaimed before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. As Haman was taking Mordecai along the street of Haman's house, right, he actually had to ride him down the street where he himself lived. Haman's daughter was standing on the roof, and she saw the spectacle, and she thought to herself, well, the one who's riding on the horse must be my father, Haman, and the one walking before him must be Mordecai, the Jew. And she then took a chamber pot full of feces and cast its contents onto the head of the one walking before the horse, meaning her father, whom she mistakenly took as Mordecai. And when Haman raised his eyes in disgust afterward and looked up at his daughter, and she saw that he was her father, and in her distress, she fell from the roof to the ground and died. So everything that Haman tried to do to have an entire population, a nation of people genocided, is all boomeranging back on himself and his own family. And this is as it is written, and Mordecai returned to the king's gate, Esther 6:12. And Rav Shesha said this means that he returned to his sackcloth and his fasting. It's not like Mordecai, who's now, being honored and glorified in the city, has any, even for a moment, stops to enjoy it and say, oh, wow, look at me, I'm so special. Because all he can think about is the death sentence is still hanging over our heads. I can't, enjoy this treatment. And so he returns to his sackcloth and ashes and fasting and the troubles of the Jewish people. And simultaneously, it says, but Haman hastened to his house, mourning, sad in mourning, and having his head covered, mourning over the death of his daughter, and having his head covered due to what had happened to him, as his head still bore the filth that she had thrown on top of him. The following verse states, and Haman recounted to Zeresh his wife and to all his friends everything that had befallen him. And then his wise men and Zeresh his wife said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, be of the seed of the Jews, and here Yehudim, right, which could mean Jews generally, or specifically the descendants of Yehuda, right, the tribe of Judah, then you shall not prevail over him, but rather you shall fall before him, says Haman's wife to him. And the Gemara comments, at the beginning of the verse, it calls them his friends. He spoke to his wife and his friends. And in the continuation of the verse, it calls them his wise men. And Rabbi Yochanan said, whoever says something wise, even if he is from the nations of the world, is called a wise man. So they're referred to as wise men here in the book of Esther. But also, they're no longer his friends, right? It's similar to Hollywood, right? Like everybody's friends with somebody on their way up. When somebody's visibly on his way down, oh, I don't know that guy. I'll give you advice, but I'm not going to share your fate. Probably a lot of businesses are like that. It's the shallowness of our society. And the Gemara explains that their wise remark, which earned them their distinction, is contained in their advice. If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, Yehudim, then you will not prevail over him. And the word Yehudim can also refer to people from the tribe of Judah. Haman's wise men thereby said to him, if he descends from the other tribes, maybe you could still prevail over him. But if he descends from the tribe of either Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, or Manasseh, you cannot prevail over him. Why? Because with regard to Judah, the proof of this is as it is written, Genesis 49:8, in the final blessings that Jacob gives his sons on his deathbed, your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies, indicating that Judah will emerge victorious over his enemies. And the proof that Haman cannot prevail over the others that are mentioned, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh, the proof of that is as it is written with regard to them in Psalm 80, verse 3, before Ephraim and Benjamin and Manasseh, stir up your might. And the wise men continued, but you shall fall, nafal tipol, before him. Esther 6:13. Rabbi Yehuda bar Eli interpreted a verse homiletically. Why are these two fallings, nafal and tipol, mentioned here? And the wise men said to Haman, this Jewish nation is compared in the Bible to the dust of the earth, and it is also compared to the stars in heaven, right? God told Abraham, your descendants shall be innumerable like the dust of the earth or the stars in heaven. And this teaches you that when they descend to the dust. And when they rise to the stars. Accordingly, when Mordecai is on the rise, you will be utterly incapable of prevailing over him. And, Jewish history has largely borne that out. We're rarely in a mediocre spot, right? Either things are terrible for the Jews or things are really good for the Jews. And often the descent can be really fast and the ascent can be super fast, even faster. Excuse me. Okay. And the next verse states, Esther 6:14, the king's chamberlains came, and they hastened, vayav hilu, to bring Haman. And this teaches that they brought him in disarray, not even giving him a chance to wash himself from the filth, right? As soon as he finishes parading Mordecai around the capital, he's summoned back to the palace. Why? For the feast, right? With Esther and the king. Now, and he hasn't even had a chance to wash off that filth, right, from the incident with his daughter. During the banquet, Esther said to Ahasuerus, for we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, to be annihilated. But if we had been sold merely to be slaves, bondmen and bondwomen, I would have held my tongue, since the affliction, tsar, would not have been worth eino shove, the damage to the king. And the Gemara explains that she said to him, this adversary, tsar, is not concerned, eino shove, about the damage that he is constantly causing to the king, right? I'm not going to trouble the king, even if all my people are going to be sold into slavery. For that, I'm not going to bother the king. But because we're all going to be murdered, yes, I will trouble the king. Meaning, by comparison, this guy troubles the king with his personal requests all the time. Where did that murderous decree come from? Because this guy said to the king, this is what I personally want. Please do it for me. And first, he was jealous of Vashti, right? Haman himself was jealous of the previous queen, Vashti, and he advised the king to get rid of her, and the king did. He killed her. As it has been explained that Memucan, who gave that advice at the beginning of the book of Esther, was Haman, right? It was just another name for Haman. And now he is jealous of Queen Esther, and he desires to kill me, the queen. And the verse states, and then said King Ahasuerus, and said, so it's this idea of the word say, to say, then said King Ahasuerus, and said to Esther the queen, he says it twice. And the Gemara asks, why do I need to say said and again said? Why is the verb for speaking used twice? It seems unnecessary. And Rabbi Bahu said, at first he spoke to her through the translator who would interpret on his behalf because he thought that she was a common woman of lowly ancestry. Once she told him that she came from the house of Saul. Immediately it says, and said to Esther the queen. Ahasuerus himself spoke to her as if she had a royal lineage. She was, now that he knew she had a royal lineage, she was a woman befitting of his status. Vashti was definitely the daughter of a king. He ended up getting rid of her, but while she was his queen, he treated her like a noble born. Esther, he thought he just liked her. He decided to marry her, but he didn't realize that she herself was a noble-born woman until now. And the next verse states, and Esther said, an adversary, an enemy, is this wicked Haman. Esther 7:6. And Rabbi Elazar said, this teaches that she was in fact pointing toward Ahasuerus, indicating that in fact he was an adversary and an enemy. And an angel came and pushed her hand toward Haman. And the verse states, and the king arose from the banquet of wine in his wrath, and he went into the palace garden. He's so furious. It's a weird moment, right? It always strikes me as weird when we read the Megillah. Now, when he finds out that this Haman has tried to destroy the Jews, and the queen is one of them, and that she's now revealing that this guy is totally working for himself, what does the king do? He's furious, but I guess he thinks to himself, I need to think, so he leaves the room. But he leaves, Haman and the queen are the only two people in the room. And the verse states, and the king arose from the banquet of wine in his wrath, and he went to the palace garden. And the next verse states, and then the king returned out of the palace garden to the place of the wine drinking. And the Gemara comments, and the verses here compare his returning to his leaving. Just as his leaving was in wrath, so too his returning was in wrath. And why did he return in wrath? For when he went out, he found ministering angels who appeared to him as people, and they were uprooting trees from the garden. And he said to them, what are you doing? Why are you uprooting my trees? And they said to him, Haman commanded us to do this. And when he entered his house, and he saw that Haman was falling upon the bed, Haman was begging the queen to spare him, to speak on his behalf. But what the king sees when he comes in is this guy, like casting himself on the queen's lap, as it were. So it was falling upon the bed. And the Gemara asks, why does it say was falling, nofel, in the present tense, implying that he was currently falling? Hadn't he already fallen? It should have said fell, nafal, in the past tense. And Rabbi Elazar said, this teaches that an angel came and pushed him down on it, and every time he would try to stand up, the angel would push him down again. And Ahasuerus said, woe unto me in the house, and woe unto me outside. As the verse continues, and then the king said, will he even force the queen before me in the house? And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold, also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman has made for Mordecai, who spoke good for the king, stands in the house of Haman. And Rabbi Elazar said, Harbona was also wicked, and he was involved in that plot to hang Mordecai in those gallows, as he also wanted Mordecai executed. But once he saw that this plot would not succeed, he immediately fled and joined Mordecai's side. And this is the meaning of that which is written, it hurls itself at him and does not spare. He would fain flee out of its hand. Job 27:22, indicating that when God sends calamity upon a wicked person, his friends immediately flee from him. And the verse states, then the king's wrath was assuaged. Shachacha. Great word. Shachacha. 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 The king's wrath was assuaged. And the Gemara asks, why are there two assuagings here? The term shachacha is used rather than shaka, and indicates doubled wrath that needed assuaging. There was one assuaging of the wrath of the king of the universe. God was furious and would be assuaged only when Haman was destroyed. And the other wrath was that of Ahasuerus. And some say Ahasuerus' wrath burned within him for two reasons. One, due to Haman's involvement with Esther, and one due to his involvement with Vashti, as now that he realizes that Haman is no friend of his, and that he has been scheming for his own gain throughout his ministry, as the king's chief minister. Now when he looks back, he's like, you know what, this guy advised me to get rid of my queen, who, was a very important woman, not just, for whatever her charms were as his wife, but also the daughter of King Belshazzar. I mean, she was a powerful entity, that brought all kinds of connections throughout the empire. And he had her killed, kind of in a drunken hissy fit at the advice of Haman. And when he thinks back on that, she's like, this guy has been bad news from the beginning. And before continuing its midrashic interpretation of the rest of the book of Esther, the Gemara expounds a verse concerning Joseph that relates to the Megillah. So we're now going a little bit of a digression of the expounding of verses back to Genesis, because the story of Joseph and Benjamin is going to appertain to what's going on here. So Genesis 45:22. To all of them, he gave each man changes of clothing, but to Benjamin, he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of clothing. Right? So when the brothers came to Egypt to get food for the family, and then they were going to go back and get their father, etc., he treated all his brothers great after he revealed himself to them. But to Benjamin, he gave extra money and extra clothing, and we can imagine it was extra fine clothing. Which leads the Gemara to ask, is it possible that in the very thing from which that righteous man, Joseph, had suffered as his father's show of favoritism toward him when he gave him the coat of many colors, and that aroused the jealousy and the enmity of his brothers, and now he, Joseph, should himself stumble in this same trap by showing favoritism to his brother Benjamin? Isn't he going to now set up Benjamin to incur the jealousy and enmity of the other brothers? Why would he do that? You'd think that he would have learned that lesson. He would never have done that, but the Torah says he did that. Why? So as Rava bar Mechasya said, that Rav Chama bar Gurya said, that Rav said, due to the weight of 2 sela of fine wool that Jacob gave to Joseph, the cost of the initial coat of many colors that he gave to Joseph, because of that one little coat, which was worth 2 sela, which added to what he gave Joseph beyond what he gave the rest of his brothers, as he made him that special coat. So because of that, the story progressed and our forefathers ended up in Egypt, right? We, the Jewish people, ended up enslaved for hundreds of years in Egypt, in that lowly place, because of that one coat worth 2 sela. So how then could Joseph have displayed similar favoritism toward Benjamin, his youngest brother? And Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet said he was not showing favoritism. Rather, and we're at the top of 16b, rather he intimated to him that a descendant was destined to issue from him, who would go out from the presence of the king wearing 5 royal garments, as it is stated, and Mordecai went forth from the presence of the king in royal apparel of sky blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a wrap of fine linen and purple. And he was a descendant of Benjamin. So that thing is, that episode of Joseph rewarding Benjamin in a special way was sort of foreshadowing of how his descendant Mordecai would be honored by the king at just the time when all the Jews stood to be annihilated and the story would totally reverse. That was actually a little foreshadowing of that. And the Gemara elaborates on certain elements in the story of Joseph and his brothers. Now that we're talking about Joseph and his brothers, the verse states with regard to Joseph, and he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck, tzavare, and wept. And the wording of the verse gives rise to a question, as the word tzavare is plural, meaning necks. How many necks did Benjamin have that it should say that Joseph fell on the necks of, plural necks, of his brother Benjamin? He only had one neck. How could he have fallen on multiple necks? And Rabbi Lazar said, this intimates that Joseph cried over the 2 temples that were destined to be in the tribal territory of Benjamin and were destined to be destroyed. Elsewhere, the temple is likened to a neck connecting the body, the earth, the Jews on earth, to our Father in heaven, and the neck is that connection. And Rabbi Lazar said this intimates that Joseph cried over 2 temples that were destined to be in the territory of Benjamin and destroyed. And the same verse continues, and Benjamin wept on his neck, on Joseph's neck, and he cried over the tabernacle of Shiloh, that was destined to be in the tribal territory of Joseph and was destined to be destroyed. So 3 temples, as it were, the tabernacle in Shiloh and the 2 temples in Jerusalem would eventually be destroyed. And they had sort of prophetic foresight of that at the time of their reunion. And the verse states, "And behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin." Genesis 45:12. Rabbi Elazar said, Joseph said to his brothers as follows, "Just as I certainly harbor no resentment in my heart toward my brother Benjamin, for he was not even present when I was sold into slavery, so too I harbor no resentment against any of you." And the verse continues, "That is my mouth, ki fi, that speaks to you, i.e., as my mouth, kefi, is, so is my heart." You hear me saying it. I do not bear a grudge against you guys. I am not angry. I'm not harboring anger against you that you sold me into slavery, because I know in my heart that all of that was destined to happen. It was all for the purpose of bringing me here to Egypt so that I could interpret the dreams of Pharaoh, prepare for the famine, etc., and be elevated in this way and save all of your lives. All these events were destined to happen. I know it was God's invisible hand doing that. I don't blame you for any of it. They didn't want to believe that, but it was true. And the verse states, "And to his father he sent after his manner 10 donkeys laden with the good things of Egypt." Right, when they went to fetch their father, he sent 10 donkeys laden with the good things of Egypt. And the Gemara asks, what are the good things of Egypt that are mentioned but not specified here? And Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet said that Rabbi Elazar said, he sent him aged wine, which the elderly find pleasing. Following Jacob's death, it states concerning Joseph, and his brothers even went and fell down before him. Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yafet said that Rabbi Elazar said, this explains the folks saying that people say, when the fox is in its hour, bow down to it. I.e., if a fox is appointed king, one must bow down before and submit oneself to it, be practical, understand, where the power stands at that moment, and don't fight it. And the Gemara expresses astonishment at the use of this parable in this situation. Are you calling Joseph a fox? Joseph HaTzadik, the great Tzaddik, the great saint Joseph, was he inferior to his brothers, such that in relation to them you call him a fox? Like they're the mighty ones who are bowing down before this lowly fox? Rather, if such a statement was stated, it was stated as follows. Not in connection with this verse, but rather in connection with a different verse. The verse states, "And Israel bowed himself upon the head of the bed." And with regard to this, Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet said that Rabbi Elazar said, when the fox is in its hour, bow down to it. As Jacob was certainly greater than Joseph, he was the previous generation and his father, but even he bowed down before the fox, as it were. And it says with regard to Joseph's remarks to his brothers, and he comforted them and he spoke to their hearts. Genesis 50, verse 21. And Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefet said that Rabbi Elazar said, this teaches that he spoke to them words that are acceptable to the heart and alleviated their fears. This is what he said. If 10 lights could not put out 1 light, right? You could not destroy me. I ended up on top. As all of you were unable to do me harm, how then could 1 light put out 10 lights? I may be the vizier of Egypt, but we're equals. I'm your brother, you're my brothers. We're all destined to be the fathers of tribes, of holy tribes. We're on the same plane. If 10 lights could not put out 1 light of the tribes, certainly 1 could not put out 10. I can't harm all of you. You don't even have to worry about that. Now the Gemara returns to its explanation of the Megillah. And the verse states, the Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. We say that by Havdalah every week. And Rabbi Yehuda said light. This is referring to the Torah that they once again studied. And similarly it says, for the mitzvah, the commandment, is a lamp, and the Torah is light. Proverbs 6:23. Gladness, simcha. This is referring to the festivals that they once again observed. And similarly it says, and you shall be glad, v'samachta, on your festival. Joy, sason, this is referring to circumcision. as they once again circumcised their sons. And similarly, it says, I rejoice, sas, at your word, Psalm 119, which the sages understood as referring to David's rejoicing over the mitzvah of circumcision. The whole idea of Judaism had come totally under threat. It's not just that the Jews were all going to be killed. It's that in that atmosphere, like nobody could enjoy being a Jew, couldn't rejoice on the festivals, couldn't rejoice by a bris, couldn't rejoice by Shabbos, etc. You all stood to be killed. Now that that evil decree was rescinded, they could go back to fulfilling the mitzvah to be samakta, right? To be happy. It is a mitzvah to be happy. It is a mitzvah to rejoice in life and our opportunity to do God's will. Honor, this is referring to tefillin, which they once again donned. And similarly, it says, and all the peoples of the earth will see that you are called by the name of the Lord, and they will be afraid of you. Deuteronomy 28:10. And it was taught in a Baraisa, Rabbi Eliezer the Great said, this is referring to the tefillin worn on the head, that everyone shall see the name of the Lord on you. Haman had banned the fulfillment of all the mitzvahs that were mentioned in this paragraph, but upon Haman's demise, the Jews returned to their observance. How are we doing on time? Pretty late. Okay, so I'm going to skip just a few paragraphs that look at the way that in the Megillah, in the book of Esther, when it says that Haman was destroyed and then his 10 sons were also hung on the gallows, the way that their names are stacked in the Megillah, like vertically, the sages interpret that what it means that they should, they were killed and they will stay down. They will never return, which we learn from the way that the words are literally written in the scroll. It's just beyond the scope of this class. But if you're curious about this, you should look it up. It's fascinating. You can Google Nazi Purim play 1948. The Nazis were such anti-Semites that they actually studied some Torah in order to utterly defeat the Jews and wipe them out, right? Just like Haman had tried to do. And one of them, I think his name was Stryker, at his execution after the Nuremberg trials, on his way to be killed, said Purim 1948 or Purim play, Purim spiel. 1948, and that's tied to the listing of the names in the book of Esther, where it's actually alluded to that there were 10 Nazis that were executed after the Nuremberg trials, and it happened on a year that was predicted in the book of Esther. Check it out. It's fascinating. Nazi Purim play 1948 execution, something like that. And, articles have been written about that. It's easy to find. Okay, the verse states, and the king said to Esther the queen, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the capital, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? And it shall be granted to you. And what more do you request? It shall be done. Esther 9:12, and Rabbi Abahu said this teaches that an angel came and slapped the king on his mouth so that he was unable to finish what he was saying. He started with a complaint about what the kings were doing, but ended on an entirely different note. I'm almost done, so make sure you get your questions and comments in. The verse states, but when she came before the king, he said with a letter. Esther 9:25. Why does it say he said? It should have said she said, right? But when she came before the king, she said with a letter, but it doesn't. It says he said with a letter. She said. It's what it should have said. It should have said she said, as it was Esther who changed the decree. And Rabbi Yochanan said, she said to Achashverosh, let it be said by word of mouth, indicating that which is written in the letter should also be ordered verbally. It needs to be backed up, right? Now that first that Haman's decree went out throughout the empire, kill all the Jews on a certain day. Then the Pony Express took out the second set of letters from Mordecai and Esther. No, in fact, the enemies of the Jews are going to be killed on that day. And what she was saying is, since the second letter contradicts the first letter, it needs extra emphasis to make sure people get that the new letter is the law. And so it should be followed with orders from all the king's officials. With regard to what is stated, words of peace and truth, Esther 9:30, Rabbi Tanchum said, and some say that Rabbi Asi said, this teaches that a Megillah scroll requires scoring, i.e. that the lines for the text must be scored into the parchment as the Torah itself, i.e. as is done in a Torah scroll. Like when a sofer, a scribe, is writing a Torah scroll or a Megillah, first he will take like some, I don't know what he uses, some kind of an edge, and makes very light lines, parallel lines, and then he comes in and makes the beautiful calligraphy of the letters on even horizontal lines. It needs to be done for a scroll of the Megillah, just like a scroll of a Torah. And finally, the verses say the matters of the fasts and their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim. Esther 9:31 and 32. And the Gemara asks, should we say that the decree of Esther indeed confirmed these matters of Purim, but the matters of the fasts did not? But didn't the fasts also contribute to the miracle? And Rabbi Yochanan said these two verses, the matters of the fast, that all the people fasted when they were in danger, and their cry, and the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, should be read as one. All these things contributed to the salvation of the Jews at that time. All right. Very good. I see somebody got a link right there. The Purim Fest 1948 story. There's a link in the comments. Thank you, Nina. Okay, questions. Here for Megillah 16. Yosef, as Sal says often, there are no coincidences. Lately, before this tractate, I had been curious about how the sages determine prophets and some of the prophets' lineages. Very cool synchronicity. Just what you were wondering about, here it came for you. Ali, how did he go from barber to high government official? Do we know? Now, I was wondering exactly the same thing. It's like I really would have liked to see that. I was kind of preparing quickly, but I'm pretty sure that it was not explained. Yeah, I don't know. We don't have a note from Rav Steinsaltz. It's not explained in the text of the Gemara. How did Haman climb that high? We also know that King Herod was descended from slaves, right? So, the ancient world, very little possibility of changing your stars, as it were, right? If you're born into poverty, to rise to nobility, seemingly impossible. And yet, there are stories, and we have them in the Bible, of people who did that, right? So there were people who somehow managed to shape their own destiny, whether for good or for evil. Haman seems like a self-made man who really could have done a lot of good for himself and others, but he was just so obsessed with his own power mongering and power pursuit, and nothing was enough for him. And he could have really, he could have had a great life and done a lot of good in the world, but all he cared about is matters of honor for himself, and it caused his complete downfall. Bell. Talmud leads us from what, as Sal said, is a story entertainingly told to children through perhaps a bedroom farce, and then into a story of kidnapping, rape, and terror, which is actually much more realistic and then much more miraculous in the outcome. Boy, Bell, you're a good writer, and I couldn't have put it better myself. Just so. Ali, Mordecai, the tribe of Benjamin, finishes off what Saul should have done. Exactly, right? So we saw that earlier, that when Saul was weak and didn't finish off the Amalekite king in the right way at the right time, it ends up being, falling to the descendant to do that and take care of business, as it were. And finally, Yosef, question, what kind of derogatory term is fox? What does this indicate about a person? Is it craftiness of some sort? I think so. In other words, a small creature that isn't really, like a lion is what you expect to be on the throne, one who is kingly. But even if you have someone, who's kind of small and furtive and, really wasn't destined for royalty and somehow ends up on that throne, well, then you treat him like a lion if you know it's good for you, right? Where else have we discussed the fox? I mean, there's the famous story in the Gemara that Rabbi Akiva and a couple other sages, what happened after the destruction of the Second Temple, they walked by the Temple Mount and the other rabbis were crying. And Rabbi Akiva laughed. And they said, how could you laugh? We live to see the destruction of the Holy Temple. And I think they probably even knew at that point that it wouldn't be rebuilt, anytime soon. It's been 2,000 years. It still hasn't been rebuilt, and they could sense that. Why would Rabbi Akiva laugh? And he said, because I just saw a fox, scoot over the ruins of the temple. And there was a prophecy, I think it's Isaiah or Jeremiah, that said that that would happen, that a fox, would scurry over the ruins of the temple. But that same prophecy said that the Lord would never abandon his people, and eventually they would be restored. Jerusalem would be restored, the temple would be restored. We're still waiting for it, but we have absolute faith that it will happen when Mashiach comes. And Rabbi Akiva said, now that I've seen the fox running over the ruins, I know that the end of the story will also happen, and we just have to wait for it. That's what I've got for us today. We're still a page behind, but as you can see, it would have been a shame to do a double daf and skip any of that. It's such colorful, wonderful stuff. So with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 17 at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Have a great night.